Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Whistlekick Martial Arts Radio, episode 425. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Joshua Blum, and we're talking about the movie 36 Chambers of Shaolin. I'm Jeremy Lesniak, your host on the show, founder of Whistlekick, lover of martial arts, and professional martial arts doer of stuff. Why is that title so vague? Because there's a lot that I'm doing. Of course, assisted by a wonderful team. We have whistlekick.com with a bunch of products, almost all of which I designed personally, so you should check those out. And if you do, use the code podcast15, gets you 15% off everything in the store, and you can see links to all the other projects that we do. Martial Arts Radio is just one of the projects that we're working on, so please check it out, show some love, and maybe share an episode or two. Today's episode is a bit different from what we typically do, but it's a good one. Mr. Joshua Blum, host of the 13th Hour podcast, reached out and said, hey, would you like to collaborate and do a movie review sort of episode with me? I said, yeah, let's do it. So we talked about movies. We ended up with 36 Chambers of Shaolin, which is, of course, a classic martial arts film that, well, we'll talk all about it. So this conversation is virtually spoiler-free. We don't dig into any of the major things. In fact, I can't imagine that listening to this conversation would at all ruin the experience of watching this movie for the first time. But it's also not so shallow to the movie that if you've seen it, you won't get more out of it. So whether or not you've seen the movie, you're going to get something out of this episode. And my hope is that if you haven't seen it afterwards, maybe you'll go check it out, because I'm glad that I did. Anyway, that's enough talking. That's a long enough intro. Let's start talking about the movie.
Welcome to the show. My name is Joshua Blum. I'm the host of the 13th Hour podcast, and I'm here with Jeremy Lesniak, a host of Whistlekick. And
hey, what's going on?
Yeah,
this is going to be fun.
This is, I believe, my first time ever doing a joint episode with another podcaster. So
well, I'm honored. Episodes that we do with other podcasters tend to go better because they know what to expect. I don't have to walk people through things, and they're confident on the microphone, and we can. It's kind of the difference between sparring with someone who's spent a bunch of time sparring,
yes,
and then sparring with someone who's never sparred but they've trained for a while.
Right. Yeah.
They know the movements, but they get in there and they're not quite sure how to connect those dots as you're working with them.
Right. Yeah. And what a good segue, because today we're actually going to be talking about a Kung Fu film, the 36 Chambers of Shaolin. And I believe it's the very first Kung Fu movie I've ever seen. And there's plenty of training and sparring sequences within the film.
There certainly are. Yeah. Yeah. Talk about a classic movie, and the irony, and I'm going to get this out of the way up front. I'm going to let everyone know this was my first time watching this movie. And it's not that I'm opposed to older movies. It's not that I'm opposed to martial arts content of any kind. It's that most of them I don't enjoy.
Yeah.
I find most of them to be, I'll be honest, kind of lame.
Yeah.
And maybe that destroys my credibility as a martial artist and martial arts podcaster, but it's the truth, man.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, if I had to pick a list of favorite films, it would be tough actually to if they were like desert island films, like assuming you had some way of playing a film on a desert island. But that being said, like it's compared to the ones that I know I would definitely want to have with me, a lot of the martial arts ones are they're kind of the same story over and over again. And once you've seen one, it's kind of like you've seen a lot of them. And some of the acting and the story is so painful that it's kind of hard to recommend. Although I have to say, with this particular one, for whatever reason, if I had to pick a film to recommend to somebody who doesn't know anything about kung fu films or martial arts films or even action films, I think I would feel confident picking this one.
I have to agree. There was something in this. Now, admittedly, I went in really nervous. When we started talking, and we kicked around some movie ideas, and there was just something about this one. It felt like the appropriate choice because it's a classic. Many people have watched it. Pretty much everyone's heard of it. they haven't watched it. And, I had a little bit of guilt that I hadn't seen it. I thought, okay, here's an opportunity for me to take a couple hours in the middle of the day and sit down and watch a movie and call it work.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Jeremy, I will own that I may have set the tone a little bit weird because I initially approached you about rewatching Bloodsport, which is a great film, but you kind of have to. It has you kind of have to be in a certain mood to do that one. And as I was going through it, I was like, oh God, there's certain parts of it that I was kind of inwardly cringing just because. JCVD, the great thespian that he is, there's some parts of it that, a certain place and time, it was fine, and the fighting sequences and everything like that there is, but there's whole stretches of the film that are not quite that, and those are the parts I was skipped over as a kid. So I'm glad we settled on this one.
Me too. But I'll admit that the first 30 minutes or so, I was regretting our choice.
Yeah.
In there and thinking, what have I gotten myself into?
Yeah.
I'm watching it. Of course, what's the first thing I do? Because I'm watching it on Netflix. I press pause and see how much I have left.
Yeah.
Oh, this isn't a 90-minute movie. This is a 2-hour movie. I have another 90 minutes of this.
Yeah.
What am I going to talk about other than this movie is terrible and I hate it? And I initially went down these very dark tangents in my mind of how could I come onto a podcast? How can I talk about this classic film that everybody loves and I hate it and not feel like a fraud? And then it changed.
Yeah.
It was almost like a light switch.
Yeah. Well, I guess for context of if you haven't seen this film, it's so it goes by a couple different names. Maybe I'll give it just a brief synopsis. I'll try not to throw. There probably will be spoilers in here, but so 36 Chamber of Shaolin. The star is Gordon Liu, and I think in the U.S. it might have been renamed Master Killer or some weird title like that, which is ironic because I don't think the main character kills anybody. But I think it's 1978, and it's one of those Shaw Brothers films, and fairly typical plot. This is like sort of somewhere in the Qing Dynasty in China. He's a student, and in his town, he and a number of other people are oppressed by the Manchus, and so his family is killed by them, and he manages to escape to the Shaolin Temple where he learns martial arts. And over a course of like 5 years, becomes a master and, goes and returns back to his home. But there are, in the temple itself, there are these 35 quote unquote chambers where different martial arts skills are taught. And he goes through those. And so his goal is to actually create a 36 chamber, which is like a way to teach Kung Fu to the common man. So just a brief synopsis of that. But the first, I don't know, what would you say, Jeremy? Maybe the first hour at least. I mean, it's kind of slow. It's all training basically.
Yeah. It was the first. I mean, it's like the first 15 or 20 minutes kind of sets up the plot.
Yeah.
You've got to establish who the good guys are and who the bad guys are and why there's conflict. So that they certainly take their time with that.
Yeah.
And as one would expect from this genre, the acting is not great. Right. The dialogue probably was better originally, but of course it's dubbed. So, we're getting a little bit less elegance and nuance, I'm sure, there. And when you talk about a Kung Fu flick without martial arts, which, really the first 30 minutes, I mean, there are people dying and fighting, but I wouldn't call it martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
That you're kind of biding your time.
Right. And I don't know, it may have been a stylistic thing of the time too. I feel like a number of films like in the 70s, maybe early 80s had that sort of, they were slower in pace, and this one definitely has a bit of a slow burn to the first half of it. And it picks up pretty quickly after that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, It's weird because this particular movie, I think I actually saw in Mandarin with my mom. I must have been like 6 or 7 or something like that. And every now and then, I lived sort of near the New York area, and if the wind blew in a certain direction, we would get like a Chinese language TV station.
Hmm.
And I think this was the movie that came on one day, and so we sat down and watched it. And the only thing I really remember from the movie is the part where the main character is training, and he's trying to jump over these logs in the water, and he repeatedly fails, and he ends up splashing into the water and everything like that. And that's the part that I remember out of everything else. So for a long time, I was like, "What is that movie?" And I didn't actually know what it was, and I forget how I actually found out that it was this one. But that was sort of my first experience with the film, and I'm interested actually to kind of rewatch the movie in its original language, because I noticed that the dubbing, like the English dub and then the English subtitles, don't actually match. They're actually quite different in some parts. So I'm kind of curious to see. And I think the original language was Mandarin that it was done in. So I'm kind of curious to see if it matches up a little bit better, because there's some
And do you
parts.
speak Mandarin?
I do speak some. I wouldn't say I'm fluent, but enough to, I think, kind of get a sense. Like sometimes when you're watching a movie in the original language, and then you read the subtitles, you're like, no, that's not at all what they said.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, it's the type of translation that now you would assume it was computer generated. Of course, it wasn't computer generated
yeah,
back then, but
yeah,
still someone who, you know, knew one of the languages and barely knew the other and just kind of, you know, put it out there and made sure that it fit the story arc. And that was about it.
right. There isn't a lot of like crucial dialogue, I would say. Like, you can still kind of get the gist of the film, and that's probably what I did when I was a kid, with just watching it. But there's a couple plot points there or whatever that, as an adult, I kind of wonder about, and kind of curious to do that. So, um, but yeah, I think it's kind of funny because when I was a kid, I mean, it was no YouTube, no internet or anything like that. So when I first started training in martial arts, this sounds really funny to say, but if a martial arts film came on TV, like I don't know, Chuck Norris film or something like that, I would actually sit down and with a notepad and like actually take notes on things, because I figured like, well, I guess if it works for Chuck Norris, it might work for me. And so I remember doing that with some of these kung fu films. They would be playing like on, this probably was when I was a teenager, but like on Sunday mornings or afternoons, and I watched a whole bunch of them. Usually missed beginning and end, but uh, the I don't even know the names of most of them or the actors involved or anything like that. But for a while, I would it was just starting. I would actually sit down and like take notes and see, and then go try these things out, like sparring sessions and stuff like that. It obviously didn't take long for me to realize that the fighting is very, very stylized and everything like that. But every now and then you'll pick up a thing or two, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe I'll give that a try.
Mm. Now, one of the things that I liked, you had alluded to the progression, the training
Yeah,
sequence. One of the things when the rest of the world was complaining about Iron Fist,
yeah,
the thing that I really loved about Iron Fist is I felt it was the most authentic portrayal of a student teacher dynamic
mm,
that I'd ever seen
yeah,
in anything approaching martial arts. The dynamic between Danny and Colleen
mhm,
as his sensei, and then in the second season, the complications around that.
yeah,
But here with 36 Chamber, we have not so much the student teacher dynamic. I mean, we get a little bit of that, but the training progression, the idea that these chambers are not necessarily linear progression. There's some opportunity for individualization there, but the idea that that training is segmented
mhm,
is something that I'm starting to see more of a return to that now as martial arts schools have more diversity of what they're teaching. And I found that really interesting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like Jeremy, you taught martial arts, but I like that they show that because it kind of shows that one, this is not an instantaneous thing. Like it's somewhat realistic in that it shows that it takes him 5 years, which I think is a reasonable time to attain some level of competence, maybe not necessarily mastery, but and that if you're going to learn a new skill, you're going to need to break it down into these isolated like little segments. Like so, for people who haven't seen the film or just as a review, like there's each of these little chambers or rooms has like a theme to it. So there's like one that's basically on footwork, which is where he's jumping over like the water, light footwork, and there's another one where he's like there's like this one where he has to just use his head. I think it's called like the head chamber, where he's like just using his head to pound against these like sandbags. And so,
let's spend a moment on that one because that was the campiest part of the entire.
Yeah,
I just found it to be so ridiculous.
Yeah,
it's not giving away a plot point, so I'll let for anyone who hasn't seen it or, as you said, hasn't seen it in a while. Imagine a bunch of heavy bags set up in kind of a gauntlet style that you have to run through, but you're expected to run through and knock them out of the way with your skull.
Yeah.
So he's headbutting these heavy bags out of the way, and he's the only one that's making it through. Everybody else is hitting two of them and falling to the floor, assumingly with some manner of concussion.
Right.
And he makes the goofiest faces and the most ridiculous noises as he's doing this. And why this hasn't become a meme, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea.
Like the perfect anecdote for posting anything political on social media, right, or really addressing any current divisive subject matter in the world. It's just banging your head against all these heavy bags. Just seems to be a better visual than banging your head against a wall.
Or I think I don't know if you saw the abbot who was like the instructor for that particular chamber. Did you see his head? Like how many like scars?
Yeah, it was disgusting.
They were on his head.
And, I mean, I look at that and think, I don't want to be in this chamber.
No, right, exactly.
I don't want my head to look like that.
Right.
You're gross.
Yeah,
put on a hat.
And is it really worth it? Is it really worth the whatever brain damage that would probably ensued to get through that? But yeah, okay, granted, right. And so there was these different chambers that were that was one of them. The literally beating your head against the wall kind of chamber, and there was a few others. Like there was the first couple, I think, were like purely conditioning. Like there was like one where he has to like hold two buckets, and then attached to his arms are like knives. And so if he has to hold them out at like a perpendicular to his body to build like shoulder strength, and then if he lets his arm sag a little bit, he'll stab himself with the knife. So there are these like variants of like torture, basically, that he has to work himself through. So I don't know if the real Shaolin Temple had like.
I don't think so, because I don't think anyone would have survived that.
Yeah.
And then the other piece I was watching as I was watching that was all he would have to do is rotate his arms a little bit, and then the knives wouldn't stab him.
Yeah, well, yeah, there was
there were some holes to that one.
Yeah, definitely some plot sort of things. Although I do remember, like, do you remember this is slight deviation, but the original Kung Fu series, like with David Carradine?
Not well.
Well, so there's also I thought it was the Shaolin Temple, but where he originally got his training, but. And I think this was a thing where one of the parts where you had to go through, you had to grab this hot burn with your forearms, and it would basically scar the inside of your forearms, but it would leave like a lasting mark, essentially like a tattoo. And so it was a very kind of similar training thing. And in the beginning. Yeah, the sequence in the beginning where the original kung fu, where he's like they have to walk across the rice paper and then he has to snatch the pebble from the master's hand. I could totally see that kind of thing fitting into a movie like this, or vice versa. So
Absolutely.
yeah, for anybody who's
Yeah,
seen that.
I don't know why we feel the need to tell the rest of the world that the heart of our training is so difficult that people bleed and are scarred and die.
Yeah, yeah,
There's no pride in that for me.
right. Well, I think, and I don't know if this gets to some of the this is a kung fu film. I mean, literally the if you look at the like what those words mean, kung fu, it's like hard work. So the training montage where he is, working hard and basically suffering his way through essentially a couple of years, right? Before he actually even learns any punching or kicking or throws or anything like that. I mean, he's basically toiling away. It's a very kind of like traditional, kind of old school way of approaching it. Um, so uh, it's kind of an interesting thing. I don't think uh, too many films kind of focus on that. Although you saw pieces of it in like films like the first Karate Kid, with all the emphasis on the yard work or the painting and everything like that before there was any actual quote unquote like formal training, right?
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah,
I think there's something to, and whether or not this was the reason, but to me that read as testing
yeah,
him. He comes in and you know is this appropriate for him to be here? And there's some dissension early on about that fact. And he remains a polarizing figure through the movie.
sure, right, yeah,
But that test, can we break him? Can we convince him that that this is not the place for him?
right, yeah. And I kind of also saw it as well. This is also like this is because there's tons of other. He's not the only one going through this, right? There's tons of other um, people in training with him, other novices, I guess. And so like this is like the task of uh, the monks. Like this is their training. This is the way that they achieve some hope of achieving enlightenment is by going through some kind of hard physical training. I mean, if it weren't kung fu, it could be something else, but something that allows them to get to I think in the film they call it like the top chamber, which is like basically mental. It's talking about these philosophical aspects of life, right? But without that hard work of knowing what suffering is and so forth. I mean, let's not forget this is a Buddhist temple, so that they might not be able to have achieved that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think the next piece to talk about was the moment, and if there's stuff more, because we're kind of moving chronologically, if there's stuff that you want to talk about before this, by all means. But the part where the main character is advocating for teaching people outside of the temple,
Yeah.
people who are not committed to this lifestyle as their full-time pursuit.
Right. Yeah.
And how might that change the world?
Right.
And that to me, it I don't know what I don't want to say that it was abrupt, that it came out of left field, but it was shocking enough to me, because up until that moment, we're seeing this guy's training, and I don't remember his name. What's the main character's name?
Oh, Sant. I think his original name was changed to the one that they give him in the temple, which was Santa.
Okay. So here he is, he's training, he's got his why. I mean, he's got a pretty powerful why. And we won't go there,
Sure.
Because it ruins the story. As you might imagine, it's because, somebody killed somebody, because that's the plot in every Kung Fu movie of this era.
Right.
But all of a sudden he has this kind of clarity and is willing to speak up and say, what if other people can learn Kung Fu?
Yeah.
And they're just so dismissive of that.
Yeah.
And I found that fascinating, because while it does affect the plot, it almost represented to me a shift. Like that was a hard shift. That wasn't, just a little bit of a detour, but the movie completely changed the way I saw it at that moment.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So I was interested in that too, and that's my second time around watching this, or I guess I don't know, maybe it's my third or fourth, but the second time I like really remember. I thought about that a little bit differently than I did like the last time I had rewatched this, which was probably, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. Um, and I thought his motivation coming was fairly typical, like for like a typical person who says like, okay, I want to learn to fight, or I want to learn martial arts for whatever reason. He wants to learn how to protect himself, right? And so he goes through the training, he learns it, and then he has memories of other people who couldn't defend themselves, and he's like, well, they should also have this opportunity as well. And then when he presents that, the head abbot is like outraged, but then the guy who's kind of like the rival with him, the guy he ends up fighting a couple times in those duels, he's told to punish our main character. And I thought the second time around watching it, I thought the way that the punishment happened was kind of like a punishment, but like wink, wink, nod kind of thing, where the guy says like, your punishment is that you have to leave the temple. But he kind of has, at least I thought he kind of had this look on his face that said like, you are going to leave the temple and in parentheses, go and do what you need to do kind of thing.
I saw it that way too.
Yeah. It's like, we can't officially condone you doing this, but we kind of think it's a good idea. And the way I kind of saw his face is like, I may disagree with you, but we're going to agree to disagree, and I respect you for that. So I don't know. That's kind of like how I saw it this time, at least.
I saw it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
I saw it in that the head abbot absolutely didn't want anything to change, which I think, there's an archetype there, the old person who is unwilling to bend, and
Right.
this is what we've always done kind of a thing. And even though the guy he fought was kicking his butt, and even though he was disciplining him,
Mm-hmm.
and then ultimately throws him out, my takeaway was that he saw the value
Mm-hmm.
in that, but
Yeah.
he was unwilling to risk his place,
Right.
his standing in the organization,
Mm-hmm.
to defend this novel idea, but saw, oh, here's a chance for you to go kind of test it,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
without any risk to himself.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think we kind of saw it the same way. And would something like that have, because would have gone the way the movie went had this been reality? Like, I don't know, like the last, by that point in the movie, like I think that's like an hour or maybe more into it, because the last 35 or 40 minutes or whatever of the movie is like basically once Santa leaves the temple and is basically going back to where his hometown, and is basically wreaking havoc on the people that tormented him and his family and his town, and he has to test himself a couple different times because he has to gain some followers, and they of course test him. You see that he manages to use all the same old skills that he learned at the temple, sort of like, which I have to say I liked, because it was kind of like there was a part where in one of the earlier chambers he had to stand still and then just use his eyes back and forth. Otherwise, if he turned his head, he would get burned by these two like I don't know, like burning incense things. And they do a callback to that where he is darting his eyes back and forth, and at this one sequence where he's being either attacked by two people or something like that. And there's another part where he has to headbutt something, and they do a little callback to him at the head chamber. So, and I think that's they do at least once. So they do these little like I thought it was an example of like the way the filmmaking actually was tried to come full circle, which I have to say I thought was pretty cool.
Absolutely. And I think any time that you show a training sequence, you have to pull some elements from that to show the usefulness of it.
Right.
Otherwise, it feels wasted. And we see that in pretty much every movie, whether it's martial arts or anything else. You see training from, Rocky movies, when he actually gets out there and he has his fight, there's going to be, a punch or a combo that you absolutely saw in training 30 times.
Right. Sure.
And I think that that's something that we can all maybe not relate to, but hopefully identify with, because we want our training to be applicable.
Mm-hmm.
We want to know that it's for something and sort of watch, oh, okay. Yeah, that plays out. That's useful.
Right.
Is something. Everyone, not just martial artists, but just everyone wants to know that the time we invest has value.
Right. And I guess the part of it that where he's testing those skills for real, this is a movie, so it's obviously the fighting is very stylized and everything like that. So what I would kind of like to see out of one of these films is where they show the quote unquote real sequences being maybe less stylized and more kind of all over the place than they kind of are in films, because that's just probably more, in the temple, there was a certain, it was training, things were controlled in a certain way. You don't have necessarily that influx of all the stress hormones and everything like that screws everything up. So, but regardless, I mean, he is very confident and handles himself very well, and attracts a bunch of followers who want to learn kung fu from him. So I thought that it sort of comes full circle in that kind of like journey of mastery, where you start in terms of really your own kind of motivations, and then you get better at things, and you're like, okay, there's a desire to, teach other people or give back in some way to the community. So I thought that was kind of a nice cycle that they showed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I liked, as he got out there, as he's attracting these followers, despite his skill, despite the time in the temple where it's very clear that he's become, kind of head of his class, or at the very least, one of the more skilled monks, the humility that he takes with him outside. I mean, he doesn't let anybody call him master, and he's very humble. It's really the only word I can use. But then there are some parts where, as you might imagine, again, it's a kung fu movie, so there has to be some kind of final battle. As we start leading towards that, his openness to some of the skills, some of the non-martial arts skills that might be useful among some of these other people, watching the things that they do and saying, wow, okay, maybe we can use this.
Right. Yeah.
And that kind of ties back for me to the conversation in the temple, where he's saying we should train people outside of the temple. And I think he was seeing that people are coming in not with nothing, they're not starting their martial arts with this complete empty vessel.
Right.
But they all have their own experiences that if we can leverage kung fu into that, how much more do we all gain?
Right. Do you remember the sequence where I think it's a blacksmith, where towards the end of the film, he's being tormented by the Manchus, and then Sansa just gives him a few tips, like, here, choke up on the handle a little bit, so you're not weighed down by this. The blacksmith was using like a big sledgehammer to defend himself, but it was so heavy that he was just really slow, and he was giving him some tips, like, just to adjust things a little bit, so he was able to utilize the weapon a little bit better. And that guy was already pretty, even though it didn't seem like he had any formal training, or at least not much. I mean, he was already pretty good at defending himself with just that, so I think it was like taking what people already kind of have, whatever resources they currently have, and then making them, tweaking them a little bit to kind of suit them a little bit better. And I could see that being very almost not the antithesis, but a very different approach from the way that he was taught. Whereas, like, we're going to break you down, assuming that you have nothing, and then build it up in this progression of skills that everybody, since the dawn of not time, but our everybody else has done this this way. So why should you be any different? Kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a lot there. There's a lot that I think we as martial artists can pull from those lessons, from the lessons as student, the lessons as teacher. And, it was right about there, so it's a 2-hour movie. I was already very open. The first 30 minutes didn't really do a lot for me.
Yeah.
But I started to get into it. And then the last 30, 40 minutes, once he leaves the temple, is such a different film. And
Right.
admittedly, if we hadn't had all of the stuff prior to that, it wouldn't have made sense or been nearly as compelling. So I'm happy for that 30 minutes that I suffered through. Probably even make a corollary to training into the movie we're talking about with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting because and I'm sure you've probably had these debates either with students or maybe just in your own head about this where you see kind of training going, because often when students come, I mean, they often want to learn all the cool tricks and everything like that, get good as quickly as possible, but it's going to be a long road, and there's always this debate about do we kind of just you tell people that you just need more time and practice and everything like that, rather than kind of fostering that inherent creativity that they may have. What about this way? What about this way? What if this happens? You kind of want to. Sometimes you may want to tell them, new students, to just kind of like just do the basic stuff first. So there was definitely something like I think inherently different about this particular character, in that even despite all the basic training that went on for years, he maintained some of that creativity, like and his own kind of way of doing things. Like, I don't know if this is actually historically accurate, probably not, but there's when he's having difficulty at one point, he creates like the 3 sectional staff to help him out. You remember that sequence?
Yeah. I think that was a really important moment.
Yeah. Kind of showing like, okay, I can use whatever tools I have with me, but I could leverage something that might be a little bit better. And if I can learn how to use that, then, so he creates this 3 sectional staff, which he uses throughout the rest of the film. And then there's another part where I thought was also an interesting use of like the environment, where I think it's like a miller, a guy who grinds rice, where he plops down on like some rice bags, and so the main character looks at that and sees all this rice flour, and he's like, wouldn't that be an interesting diversion to be able to use? And they use that shortly, in a future sequence, for exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah. I suspect you're right that the idea of the creativity, everything we know of martial arts today, when we talk about tradition, we're talking about doing it in a very specific way.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think that there is something to be said for that creative element, the ability to find one's own space to make those movements or those sequences your own. Mm-hmm. I think that's important. I think it's important as an instructor to make sure that students have space to carve out their own identity as a martial artist. And I think it's important for the rest of the school, the class, because if everyone's doing the exact same thing, yes, there's a standardization there. There is some benefit there, but everyone's a little bit different. Mm-hmm. So to identify, hey, this person does this in this slightly different way, and that works for them, and also these other 6 other people.
Right. Yeah.
So everyone can benefit from that. And admittedly, the school, I've trained in a lot of different schools, and if this is not your school, I'm not belittling it by any means, but as a general rule, the schools that I've trained at where people have some space for carving out their own identity mm-hmm. as a martial artist, they tend to have better students than those who suppress that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of this sort of battle between, well, this has worked for hundreds, in some cases maybe thousands of years, so if you just trust the system, then it'll work for you. And there's an argument to be made there. Um, on the other hand, like you said, everybody's a little bit different. Everybody has a different body type, different advantages and disadvantages in terms of reach or mobility or whatever. So sometimes you end up beating your head against the wall, literally, I guess, or figuratively, and discovering that something is just not going to work for you just based on your particular makeup for whatever reason. And so I don't know if it's interesting in a film like this. I don't know if his instructors were kind of open to that, though he ends up kind of coming up with that himself, I think.
Right. Right. I think, we start to learn about him very early on that because of his why, because of the whole crux of the movie, the reason that he's come to train, he's not going to let anything stand in that way. So,
Right.
He goes off and there's a tremendous amount of time training solo,
Right.
Working on these things that he couldn't get during the day. And he goes and he spends, we don't know how long, but the implication is that it's a great deal of his personal time.
Right. Yeah. Which I think is such an important, again, an important lesson for anybody who's, probably is anything really, but for martial arts, because even if you are, let's say you go to a couple classes a week, that's like a couple hours out of like 168 hours in the average week. So, so much of your time is not going to be spent in that studio. And so often you'll hear people say, well, I couldn't train because, it's bad weather outside, or, I had this other thing to do or whatever. But there's often something you can do. And so many of the things that are shown in this film that he's doing are things that he's doing by himself, like in the middle of the night, or don't really necessarily require that much in terms of equipment or even another person. So I think it's just that idea of consistent practice, even if it doesn't necessarily look exactly like what your end goal is. There's probably pieces that you can break down and do. So I like that they showed that, because I think often some of these films want to get right to the fighting part without showing in all the work that someone did to get to that point. So,
yeah, and I think that I'm guessing that this is why this movie resonated for me.
Yeah,
is that it started off being about fighting, but it wasn't.
Yeah,
and of course there is that huge plot element in the story arc, and I think most martial arts films have that fight aspect,
right.
certainly, or they're not martial arts films. But I think the fighting in this was so secondary
Mm-hmm.
that you almost could take out everything beyond beyond the elements that create the why
Right.
for the character. And the movie, while it would be boring, the outcome would be pretty similar.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right, and I think it's probably one of those reasons why, like, if you were to show this to a very general audience, I think people would be able to appreciate it, not just the martial arts aficionados. I don't know if I would go so far as to call this movie a potential date movie, unless your date is another martial arts person, or enjoys kung fu films or whatever. But I think it has more of a general appeal than some of the other Sunday afternoon kung fu theater type fare that you typically get. So
I definitely think it's more generally applicable.
yeah. Well, one thing I'd say is, like, I very rarely have time to watch anything these days. So the only time I will typically watch something is in little segments when I put like a computer in front of a treadmill. So so I watch this movie in like two parts. I'll be running at the same time, and I actually found that the training montage where he was going through all those toils, it actually found it motivating. I don't know if that says something weird about me as a person, but at the same time, when I was running and in pain, I found it sort of motivating to have somebody else also doing the same thing, I guess.
Mm, I could see that.
Yeah. So I at times when I guess one of my takeaways from this is if I notice my motivation for whatever in the future flagging, I may rewatch parts of the film that you get at that part because it is. I mean, you can see like his drive. Like there's just like the one part that I mentioned before about jumping over these logs in the water. You know, he can't do it. He tries and tries and tries, and he just gets frustrated. And then later at night, he I think he wakes. He's like kicking his legs or whatever in his sleep, and he wakes up and in the middle of the night he gets out and he practices again and again and again, and then he eventually gets it. You know, he finds a technique that works for him, but he wouldn't have gotten there had it not been for that practice. And I think that that's like at least for me is good, you know, inspiration.
I think that's something we can all relate to
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know what else I, there is to say without, spoiling it. And I'd rather not do that.
Well, I think the only thing I'll say is that many of these films, but I think this one probably more so because I think this one attains a fair amount of fame. I mean, this was like influential, I think, for tons of people. Like, there's so much influence of like martial arts, particularly like the kung fu films, of, like this era, or like 70s, early 80s, on elements of like hip hop, for example, breakdancing, that kind of thing, where the movements were taken and inspired by or inspired people who had, different time and place, but they saw something in the film, whether they were inspired by the movements or just the stories of like oppression and discrimination or whatever. They saw elements of that in their own life, and they saw how something, in this case, a physical sort of thing, could be helpful. So I think if you look at these films in sort of that historical context, it's kind of interesting. It makes them a little bit more than just, well, a kung fu flick.
Sure. And, for people who know me personally, or at least know me a little bit better than casually, I, my preferred music genre is hip hop. And so I'd be remiss if I let this show come to an end without mentioning the fact that in that first 30 minutes, the part where I was bored, the thing that kept me most engaged was picking up the samples that the Wu-Tang Clan had used mostly in their first album, but I picked up some bits that had been used in others. And of course, their very first album, Enter the Wu-Tang parentheses 36 Chambers. I mean, it's such a tribute to this film specifically throughout that album. And of course, if we got into a discussion on hip hop, we could talk about how that album completely changed the trajectory of hip hop music.
Of course, yeah.
So likely no coincidence that this movie was that influential on those gentlemen, right, and starting their career.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's. I don't know if there's other things to mention, but I think that's a pretty good place to wrap things up.
It is, and I think anyone who is not a fan of this genre of movie, this 70s campy Shaw Brothers sort of flick, I think you should give it a chance. I think, once I was done watching it, it was pretty clear to me that there's a reason that this movie specifically is referenced so often, that there's something different about it. And I spent a little bit of time digging around the web and found that I'm not the only person who feels this way. That this is an excellent example of what those movies could have been. And for some reason, this one is.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And I think the I guess the applicability to today, even, this is over 30 years ago, is that for even if you're not necessarily involved with martial arts, I think it kind of like a movie like The Karate Kid or Rocky, you may be able to take elements of the persistence, don't give up kind of determination, kind of attitude that's exemplified here, and probably use it in aspects of your own life.
Totally. All right, I'm good. We good to wind this down then?
I think so. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, you too.
I'm glad you watched the movie and gave it a chance and
You too.
got some.
I'm glad you suggested it
Yeah.
because I admittedly I wouldn't have otherwise.
No worries. Yeah,
We'll have to do this again.
absolutely. All right, take care, Jeremy. Thanks so much.
I had a great time. This was my first time talking with Mr. Blum, and I'm glad that I had the chance to. Hopefully it happens again. So thanks for reaching out, sir. Had a lot of fun. Let's stay in touch. Now, of course, you may have picked up that Mr. Blum has his own show, The 13th Hour. We didn't talk about that. In fact, I'm very aware now as I'm recording this outro, we didn't talk about our respective stuff at all. But I want you to go find his show. We've got links at whistlekickmartialartsradio.com. So go check out his podcast. It's absolutely wonderful. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Follow him on social media, all that. Let's show some love. If you want to show us some love, at Whistlekick, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, whistlekick.com, the store, 15% off, podcast 15. Rate, review, like, share, comment, all those things. Anything you do, anything you engage with related to Whistlekick helps us. So whatever works for you to show your support, ultimately it helps the show grow, it helps Whistlekick grow, and it makes me feel good. We've all got those days, right? So on those days where I'm feeling like things aren't going anywhere, to see a comment or a like or a share, it helps. It helps more than you might imagine. If you want to email me, jeremy@whistlekick.com. Until next time, train hard, smile, and have a great day.